The Grand Bel Air estate shook with the violent sound of a slamming door that echoed across the imported marble floors like sudden thunder in the quiet morning. Edward Montgomery, a highly successful real estate mogul, descended the sweeping, curved staircase, 2 steps at a time, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. His voice, usually so composed and authoritative in boardrooms, cut through the serene California morning air like a jagged blade, demanding that Chloe come inside immediately. Out in the vast sunlit backyard, where the golden rays of the morning sun filtered beautifully through the ancient oak trees, Chloe Harper looked up from the elaborate sandcastle she was building with her 2 young charges. The 3 of them froze completely, as if time itself had decided to stop and brace for the incoming storm that was about to shatter their peaceful existence. Sophia, who was only 5 years old, whispered that her daddy sounded incredibly angry, her large blue eyes rapidly filling with frightened tears as she desperately clutched Chloe's arm for safety. The little girl had tragically learned to recognize those harsh tones, the exact same ones that had preceded the silent, tearful nights following her mother's passing a few years prior. Isabella, possessing a quiet wisdom far beyond her 8 years of life, immediately stood up and placed herself protectively in front of her younger sister. She tried to assure Sophia that Chloe had done nothing wrong, yet there was an undeniable tremor in the young girl's voice that betrayed her own underlying fear of her father's wrath. The heavy, furious footsteps of Edward Montgomery grew louder and more intimidating as he approached the glass patio doors leading to the pristine garden. Chloe slowly brushed the damp sand from her hands with deliberate, measured movements, trying to buy just a few extra seconds to mentally prepare the 2 innocent girls for whatever disaster was looming. In the 2 years she had spent caring for the Montgomery children, she had seen Edward deeply stressed, emotionally distant, and profoundly melancholic, but she had never witnessed this terrifying, icy rage. With a heavily forced smile that completely failed to hide her trembling lips, Chloe softly asked the young ladies to please step inside the house and go to their playroom. Sophia screamed a defiant refusal, wrapping her small arms around Chloe's waist with surprising strength, sobbing that she did not want her father to yell at the only person who was consistently kind to them. Edward suddenly appeared at the threshold of the sliding glass doors, presenting a devastating image of a man entirely consumed by his own unmanaged stress and towering pride. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his expensive dress shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes held a freezing glare that pierced right through Chloe's heart like a sharpened icicle. He barked an absolute order for his daughters to go inside immediately, completely ignoring Isabella's brave attempt to explain that they were simply playing a harmless game in the sand. When Edward roared his command a second time, the sheer volume of his voice sent a flock of birds scattering from the nearby oak branches in a frantic explosion of fluttering wings. The little girls jumped as if they had been physically struck, and Sophia immediately broke down into those deep, heart-wrenching sobs that can only come from a truly terrified and confused child. Chloe rose to her feet with quiet dignity, instinctively positioning her own body as a physical barrier between the furious billionaire and his weeping, trembling daughters. She softly pleaded with Mr. Montgomery not to raise his voice at the children, swearing that they had behaved perfectly all morning and did not deserve such a frightening outburst. Edward let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded exactly like heavy boots crushing shattered glass, sarcastically mocking the idea that his daughters had done absolutely nothing wrong. He furiously demanded to know how his 8-year-old daughter suddenly knew more about his precarious financial investments than some of the senior executives working at his downtown corporate office. He cornered Chloe, asking how she could possibly explain why Isabella had asked him the previous night if Uncle Richard was right about their family losing absolutely everything they owned. All the warm color instantly drained from Chloe's face as she stammered in genuine confusion, swearing on her life that she had no idea what he was talking about. Edward took a threatening step closer, and for the first time in her 2 years of dedicated employment, Chloe felt a genuine wave of physical fear wash over her trembling body. He accused her of eavesdropping on his private telephone conversations, maliciously suggesting that she was actively poisoning his daughter's innocent minds with highly confidential financial information that did not concern them. Isabella bravely stepped out from behind Chloe, stating with heartbreaking courage that they only asked Chloe so many questions because their father was practically a ghost who was never actually home to speak with them. The heavy silence that followed this profound declaration was deafening. Edward stared at his eldest daughter as if she had just driven a steel blade directly into his chest. Despite the crushing truth delivered by a child, Edward's wounded pride forced him to double down, his voice shaking with a terrible mixture of anger and regret as he ordered Chloe to leave his property. He gave the stunned nanny exactly 1 hour to pack her belongings and vacate the premises, screaming that he never wanted to see her anywhere near his precious daughters ever again. Eleanor, the family's loyal housekeeper of 15 years, ran out from the kitchen just in time to witness Sophia desperately clinging to Chloe, wailing that Chloe was the only one who actually loved them. As Edward turned his back and walked away completely blinded by his own arrogant fury, he completely missed Isabella, fiercely whispering a promise to Chloe that they would find her no matter what it took. 3 agonizing days had passed since Chloe Harper had walked out of the heavy iron gates of the Montgomery estate for the last time, and the massive house felt entirely stripped of its soul. The long, luxurious hallways echoed with a depressing emptiness. The beautifully manicured gardens remained entirely devoid of childish laughter, and a suffocating silence had settled over every single room. Isabella had steadfastly refused to speak a single word to her father since that catastrophic morning, glaring at him during their tense, silent meals, with eyes that looked like deep, dark wells of eternal disappointment. Sophia, meanwhile, had developed a truly heartbreaking daily routine of waking up and immediately asking the empty room if Chloe had returned, before sobbing herself back to sleep, while clutching a blanket that still carried the faint scent of the nanny's lavender perfume. Eleanor, the elderly housekeeper who had practically helped raise Edward when he was a boy, nervously approached him in the formal dining room while serving his black coffee. She bravely informed him that the girls were completely refusing to eat, noting with deep concern that Isabella had barely managed 2 small bites of her dinner the previous evening. Edward stubbornly kept his eyes glued to the morning newspaper, though the printed words were entirely blurry to his exhausted eyes, and dismissively asked what was wrong with his youngest daughter. Eleanor's voice trembled with genuine sorrow as she explained that Sophia only wanted to hear the specific bedtime stories that Chloe used to tell, crying that nobody else knew how to do the funny character voices correctly. Edward forcefully slammed the newspaper down onto the mahogany table, his own pronounced dark circles loudly betraying the fact that he had not slept more than a few hours in 3 days. He coldly insisted that children are naturally resilient and that they would eventually forget about the nanny and adjust to the new necessary reality of their daily lives. Eleanor took a bold step forward respectfully, but firmly telling her wealthy employer that he was entirely wrong, reminding him that these specific little girls had already lost way too much in their incredibly short lives. This thinly veiled reference to his late wife hit Edward like a physical blow to the jaw, and he was just about to severely reprimand the housekeeper when a blood-curdling scream echoed from upstairs. Edward and Eleanor rushed frantically to the 2nd floor, finding 5-year-old Sophia sitting in the middle of the hallway corridor, completely hysterical, while Isabella desperately tried to comfort her. Sophia was sobbing uncontrollably over a broken string of cheap imitation pearls that Chloe had bought her at a dollar store crying that the necklace was ruined, and now Chloe would never come back to fix it. Edward immediately dropped to his knees, his heart clenching painfully in his chest, and gently promised his youngest daughter that he would buy her a brand-new genuine pearl necklace that same afternoon. Sophia furiously pushed her father's hands away, screaming that she did not want his expensive gifts. She only wanted the cheap plastic beads that smelled like Chloe, and she wanted her nanny back. Isabella watched her father's pathetic attempt to buy Sophia's affection with an analytical expression that was deeply unsettling to see on the face of an 8-year-old child. When Edward tentatively reached out to touch his eldest daughter's shoulder, Isabella deliberately took a slow, calculated step backward, effectively treating her own father like a highly contagious stranger. Edward begged Isabella to speak to him, acknowledging that she was terribly angry, but Isabella calmly replied that she was not angry at all. She was just incredibly disappointed, noting that Chloe had taught them the difference. Those heavy words, delivered with the absolute unyielding gravity of a Supreme Court judge, forced Edward to slowly stand up, feeling as though he had aged 10 full years in a matter of seconds. Later that exact same night, after Eleanor had finally managed to lull an exhausted Sophia to sleep by awkwardly humming an out-of-tune melody, Isabella remained wide awake beneath her heavy duvet. She was not merely resting. She was meticulously plotting a complex rescue mission beneath the soft glow of her pink princess flashlight, writing furiously in a small notebook Chloe had gifted her for her birthday. On the very first lined page, using her absolute neatest second-grade handwriting, the young girl proudly titled the document as her official master plan to find and rescue Chloe Harper. She began listing every tiny detail she could possibly remember from her late-night chats with her beloved nanny, piecing together the puzzle of Chloe's private life outside the wealthy bubble of Bel Air. Isabella documented that Chloe lived in a neighborhood in East Los Angeles. She had to take 2 different public transit buses to get to work, and her mother Evelyn was very sick and needed expensive medications. A tiny voice suddenly whispered from the adjacent bed, and Isabella quickly clicked off her flashlight, thinking she had accidentally woken her little sister with the scratching sound of her pencil. Sophia quietly admitted that she was too sad to sleep, asking her older sister with heartbreaking innocence if she thought Chloe missed them as much as they missed her. Isabella slid silently out of her bed and crawled under the covers next to Sophia, firmly whispering that, of course, Chloe missed them, but adults were often too foolish and proud to admit their terrible mistakes. Sophia eagerly sat up in the darkness, her bright eyes suddenly shining with a fierce, unexpected glimmer of hope, and boldly suggested that they should just leave the house and go find their nanny themselves. Isabella felt a massive surge of pride and determination welling up in her chest. She immediately swore her little sister to absolute secrecy, explaining that their father and Eleanor would never understand their mission. For the next hour, the 2 brave siblings whispered in the pitch-black room, combining their shared memories to remember that Chloe lived near the Golden Wheat Bakery in a house with a faded green door. Unbeknownst to the plotting children, Edward was standing silently right outside their slightly opened bedroom door, silently weeping into his hands as he realized his daughters possessed infinitely more courage and loyalty than he did. The bright California sun was barely peeking over the rolling hills of Los Angeles when Isabella awoke with the focused, intense determination of a seasoned military general preparing for a massive campaign. Despite having slept for perhaps 3 short hours, her mind was incredibly sharp and entirely focused on executing the most daring and dangerous mission a child could possibly attempt. Sophia was still sleeping peacefully, clutching the carefully gathered plastic pearls tightly against her chest, her face relaxed and free from the sorrow that usually plagued her waking hours. Isabella gently shook her sister's shoulder, whispering that it was finally time to begin their secret operation and Sophia immediately sat up, her eyes wide and fully alert. The two girls quietly agreed on their designated roles for the morning. Sophia was to act completely normal, but ask highly specific, innocent-sounding questions, while Isabella would silently analyze the answers to gather critical logistics. When they gracefully descended the sweeping staircase for breakfast, they found Edward already sitting at the long dining table, looking more defeated and hollowed out than they had ever seen him. His expensive custom suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and the heavy bags under his eyes suggested a man entirely consumed by his own tragic, irreversible decisions. Sophia, executing her role perfectly, marched right up to her exhausted father and asked him directly with brutal, childish honesty if he was feeling incredibly sad because he missed Chloe too. Edward nearly choked on his hot coffee, coughing violently, while Eleanor accidentally dropped a heavy silver serving spoon onto the floor with a deafening metallic clatter that echoed through the room. He attempted to force a reassuring smile, softly telling Sophia that he was perfectly fine, but his voice cracked horribly, betraying the immense ocean of regret hiding just beneath his stoic facade. Sophia wisely pointed out that Chloe always taught them that when someone looks very sad, it simply means they desperately need a warm hug to feel better. Edward immediately pulled his youngest daughter into a desperate embrace, and Isabella keenly observed that her father's large hands were shaking violently, filing this crucial piece of emotional intelligence away in her active mind. Taking advantage of the highly emotional distraction, Isabella casually turned to the housekeeper and asked, under the clever guise of a school geography project, exactly how someone would travel to East Los Angeles from their neighborhood. Eleanor, entirely oblivious to the child's ulterior motives, wiped a tear from her eye and explained that it was a very long, difficult journey that required taking two separate public buses. She detailed how one must first catch a bus near the Beverly Center shopping mall, ride it all the way into busy downtown Los Angeles, and then transfer to a different line heading east. Isabella absorbed every single syllable like a dry sponge, mentally tracing the complicated urban route, while Sophia innocently asked exactly how many hours such a tiring journey would take a person. Eleanor sighed deeply, noting that the commute took Chloe nearly 2 full hours each way, which meant the poor girl had to wake up before dawn just to prepare their breakfast on time. Edward shifted uncomfortably in his antique chair. This staggering piece of information was entirely new to him, and the sudden realization of Chloe's quiet daily sacrifices felt like another sharp knife twisting in his gut. When Isabella asked if the journey was dangerous, Eleanor firmly stated that it certainly would be for 2 little girls, but Chloe knew the sprawling city well enough to stay safe. Unable to bear the overwhelming guilt for another second, Edward abruptly stood up his chair, loudly scraping the floor, and ordered Eleanor to ensure the girls never left the property unsupervised before fleeing the room. Later that morning, while the girls were pretending to read quietly in the massive library, they suddenly heard the booming, arrogant voice of their Uncle Richard echoing from their father's private study. The girls crept silently toward the heavy oak door, pressing their small ears against the wood, just in time to hear Richard congratulating Edward for ruthlessly protecting his financial assets from a snooping employee. Edward's voice, completely stripped of its usual commanding power, sounded utterly broken as he confessed that his daughters hated him. His house felt like a tomb, and he was terrified he had made a colossal mistake. Richard harshly demanded to know why Edward didn't just apologize and rehire the girl, if he felt so guilty, leading to a long, agonizing silence that filled the grand hallway. When Edward finally answered his brother, his voice was barely a trembling whisper, admitting that if he confessed he was entirely wrong about Chloe, he would have to face how wrong he had been about everything else. The girls tiptoed back to the library, their hearts pounding in their chests. Isabella looked at her sister with blazing eyes, declaring that since their father was too cowardly to fix his mistake, they would simply have to be braver than him. Saturday arrived with a flurry of activity, as Eleanor had promised to take the girls to the luxurious Beverly Center Mall to purchase an expensive gift for their father. While Eleanor was completely distracted, admiring a lavish window display of diamond jewelry, Isabella gave Sophia a sharp nod, signaling the beginning of the most critical phase of their entire intelligence-gathering operation. Isabella swiftly slipped away into the bustling mall crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs, and confidently approached a friendly-looking security guard standing near the main glass exit doors. She politely asked the uniformed man exactly how much a bus ticket to downtown Los Angeles cost, spinning a flawless lie about needing to know for a school math assignment regarding public transportation. The guard smiled kindly and explained that the fare was exactly $20 per person for the entire trip, meaning Isabella quickly calculated they would need exactly $80 for a round trip for two. She rushed back to find Sophia, successfully distracting Eleanor in a high-end pet store. Their plan was fully funded by their piggy banks, and tomorrow they would finally bring their beloved Nanny home. Sunday morning dawned with a brilliantly clear sky, the kind of perfect California day that made the wealthy residents of Bel Air feel entirely secure in their isolated, pristine bubbles of absolute luxury. Isabella woke up with her stomach completely tied in nervous knots, knowing that today was the day they would either save their broken family or get into the worst trouble of their entire lives. Sophia was already sitting at the edge of her bed, wearing her favorite sturdy sneakers and clutching a tiny pink backpack loaded with 3 chocolate chip cookies, 2 water bottles, and her favorite stuffed bear. Eleanor called up the stairs, announcing that she was leaving for her weekly church service, and that their father was securely locked in his home office for a highly important 3-hour virtual business meeting. The heavy front door clicked shut, and the absolute silence of the massive house served as the final starting pistol for the girls' incredibly daring and meticulously planned urban escape. They crept down the back staircase and quietly slipped into the kitchen, where Isabella carefully opened the ceramic jar, where Eleanor kept emergency cash for tipping delivery drivers and buying last-minute groceries. With shaking fingers, Isabella counted out exactly $80 in crisp bills, leaving behind a carefully written note promising to pay back every single penny from their future weekly allowances. They slipped out through the heavy iron gates of the estate, walking rapidly down the tree-lined streets toward the busy commercial avenue, holding hands so tightly that their small knuckles turned completely white. The bustling bus stop near the mall was a chaotic sensory overload for the sheltered children, filled with loudly chatting teenagers, tired workers, and the overwhelming smell of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. When the massive city bus finally hissed to a halt in front of them, its folding doors opening like the mouth of a giant mechanical beast, Isabella swallowed her paralyzing fear and stepped aboard. She handed $40 to the driver, a large, kindly-looking man with a graying beard whose name tag read Marcus, confidently asking for 2 tickets heading toward the bustling downtown transit center. Marcus raised a thick eyebrow, looking around the empty sidewalk behind them, and asked the young girls in a deeply concerned voice exactly where their parents were hiding on such a busy Sunday morning. Isabella recited her thoroughly rehearsed lie without missing a single beat, claiming that their grandmother was waiting for them right at the downtown terminal because their parents were trapped in emergency work meetings. Marcus stared at them for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes filled with obvious doubt, but eventually he printed their paper tickets and sternly told them to sit directly behind his seat, where he could watch them. The long ride through the sprawling city was a mesmerizing and terrifying experience for the girls, as the pristine, manicured lawns of the West Side gradually gave way to towering skyscrapers and crowded, dirty sidewalks. Sophia remained entirely silent, her face pressed tightly against the smudged glass window, occasionally gripping Isabella's arm whenever the large bus hit a massive pothole or screeched to a sudden violent halt. When Marcus finally announced their arrival at the central downtown terminal, the sheer volume of screaming crowds, blaring horns, and rushing commuters nearly sent Isabella into a state of total panic. However, she remembered Chloe's gentle voice telling her that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but rather taking action despite being completely terrified, so she grabbed Sophia's hand and plunged into the massive crowd. After 20 minutes of frantic searching and reading dozens of confusing digital signs, they finally located the older, slightly battered bus that would take them directly into the heart of East Los Angeles. This second bus smelled heavily of old vinyl and strong cleaning chemicals, and the passengers looked exhausted, carrying heavy grocery bags and wearing the worn-out uniforms of the city's essential working class. As the bus rolled deep into the eastern neighborhoods, the shiny glass towers disappeared, completely replaced by colorful murals, small family-owned taco stands, and modest homes packed tightly together behind chain-link fences. Isabella nervously checked the small detailed map she had drawn in her notebook, anxiously waiting for the driver to announce the specific intersection where the famous Golden Wheat Bakery was located. When the loud intercom finally crackled with the name of their highly anticipated stop, the girls practically scrambled over each other to exit through the rear doors, stepping out onto a sun-baked, unfamiliar pavement. The delicious, comforting smell of freshly baked sweetbread immediately washed over them, providing a desperately needed moment of calm as they stood outside the brightly painted bakery, trying to find their bearings. Isabella bravely pushed open the glass door of the bakery, a little bell chiming brightly overhead, and approached a plump, smiling woman wearing a flour-dusted apron, whose name tag identified her as Mrs. Higgins. Mustering every ounce of her remaining courage, Isabella politely asked the friendly baker if she happened to know where a young woman named Chloe Harper lived with her sick mother, Evelyn. Mrs. Higgins's smile widened into a massive, warm beam, proudly declaring that everyone in the neighborhood knew and loved the Harper family before giving the girls highly specific walking directions down a nearby side street. She pointed a flour-covered finger toward a narrow alleyway, explaining that Chloe lived exactly 3 blocks down in the very last small house on the left, which famously featured a bright green front door. The girls thanked the baker and practically sprinted down the cracked sidewalk, their exhausted little legs pumping with pure, unadulterated adrenaline as they navigated the colorful, music-filled streets of the vibrant neighborhood. Finally, they spotted it, a tiny, impeccably neat stucco house with a brilliantly painted green door and a small porch completely overflowing with flourishing, beautiful potted plants of every imaginable variety. Isabella stopped dead in her tracks, her chest heaving with exertion, suddenly struck by the terrifying thought that perhaps Chloe was still incredibly angry and would simply refuse to open the door. Sophia, possessing none of her older sister's complicated adult anxieties, marched straight up the concrete steps, balled her tiny fist, and pounded on the green wood with all the furious strength her small body could muster. The heavy wooden door slowly creaked open, and for a split second the small entryway remained completely silent, before a sudden ear-piercing gasp of absolute shock completely shattered the quiet afternoon air. Chloe Harper stood in the doorway, wearing faded sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her usually vibrant face pale, and her beautiful eyes incredibly red and swollen from what was clearly days of non-stop weeping. For a moment, she simply stared at the 2 wealthy little girls standing on her modest concrete porch, entirely convinced that her grieving mind was playing a cruel, highly detailed hallucination on her. Then Sophia let out a massive, soul-shattering sob and launched her tiny body forward, crashing into Chloe's legs with such desperate clinging force that the young nanny nearly lost her balance and fell backward. Chloe instantly collapsed onto her knees right there in the doorway, violently throwing her arms around both girls and burying her tear-soaked face into their shoulders, sobbing with a mixture of absolute joy and pure terror. She frantically kissed their heads, her shaking hands running over their hair and faces to ensure they were entirely real and completely unharmed, repeatedly whispering their names like a sacred, desperately needed prayer. After dragging them safely inside the incredibly small but meticulously clean living room, Chloe demanded to know exactly how they had managed to cross the massive city, absolutely terrified that their father was frantically searching for them. Isabella proudly detailed their highly complex bus journey, causing Chloe's heart to nearly stop dead in her chest at the terrifying thought of these precious, sheltered children navigating the dangerous downtown transit center entirely alone. A gentle, raspy voice suddenly floated from the tiny back bedroom, and a frail but beautiful older woman slowly shuffled into the living area, heavily leaning on a polished wooden cane for necessary support. This was Evelyn Harper Chloe's deeply beloved mother, whose warm, intelligent eyes immediately crinkled into a massive smile as she looked at the two young girls her daughter had cried over for nearly a week. Evelyn softly expressed that she felt like she already knew them perfectly, explaining that Chloe talked about Isabella's brilliant mind and Sophia's massive heart every single day since she had been so cruelly fired. Sophia immediately ran over and gently hugged the elderly woman around her waist, proudly declaring that she had brought her favorite stuffed bear just in case Evelyn needed a friend while she was feeling sick. Chloe practically lunged for her cracked cellular phone resting on the small kitchen counter, her fingers trembling wildly as she declared she had to call Edward Montgomery immediately before he completely lost his mind with panic. Isabella forcefully grabbed Chloe's hand, looking up with incredibly serious ancient eyes, and begged the nanny to wait just 5 short minutes so they could finally explain the absolute truth about why they had run away. Isabella took a massive, shuddering breath and revealed the closely guarded secret the girls had been hiding behind the library sofa, playing hide-and-seek, when they accidentally overheard Uncle Richard yelling at their father about losing terrible amounts of money. Chloe completely froze in place, the phone slipping slightly in her sweaty grip as the staggering weight of this massive revelation slowly washed over her deeply exhausted and emotionally shattered mind. Sophia eagerly chimed in, loudly explaining that because their father was always hiding in his office, they had naturally asked Chloe to explain what going completely bankrupt meant entirely innocently and without any malicious intent. The tragic puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together in Chloe's mind. Edward had entirely assumed she was maliciously eavesdropping on his highly confidential business calls, punishing her severely for the innocent curiosity of his own bored children. Evelyn gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hand, deeply horrified that her wonderful, fiercely loyal daughter had been viciously humiliated and thrown out into the street for a crime she did not commit. Chloe dropped to the floor, completely overwhelmed by a massive tidal wave of relief and lingering pain, finally realizing she had not failed her beloved girls, but rather their paranoid father had catastrophically failed her. Suddenly, the cracked screen of Chloe's cellular phone lit up brightly, loudly blaring a generic ringtone that made everyone in the tiny living room jump completely out of their skin in sheer terror. The caller identification boldly displayed the name Edward Montgomery, and Chloe quickly swiped the screen to answer immediately, putting the device on speakerphone so everyone in the room could clearly hear the incoming conversation. Edward's voice exploded from the tiny speaker, sounding absolutely nothing like the powerful, arrogant billionaire who had thrown her out. He sounded completely shattered, hysterically begging Chloe to tell him if his missing daughters were with her. Chloe kept her voice remarkably steady and entirely professional, assuring the frantic, weeping father that both of his young daughters were sitting safely in her living room and were completely unharmed. A massive, tearing sob of pure, unadulterated relief echoed through the phone speaker, followed by Edward furiously demanding to know what kind of absolute lunacy possessed his children to run away into a dangerous city. Isabella leaned directly over the phone and spoke with the stern, unforgiving authority of a deeply disappointed parent, reprimanding a foolish child, stating loudly that they ran away because he was a massive, stubborn coward. She ruthlessly exposed the entire truth over the speakerphone, explaining in brutal detail how they had overheard Uncle Richard in the library, completely exonerating Chloe of any wrongdoing or malicious corporate espionage. The silence that instantly fell over the telephone line was incredibly heavy and profoundly suffocating, stretching on for what felt like an eternity, while Edward mentally processed the catastrophic magnitude of his own arrogant stupidity. When Edward finally found his voice again, it was incredibly soft, entirely broken, and completely stripped of every single ounce of his usual corporate pride and towering, unyielding ego. He began to weep openly over the phone, issuing a deeply profound, agonizing apology to Chloe, admitting that he had let his own paranoid fears and massive insecurities completely destroy the best thing that had ever happened to his family. He begged Chloe for a chance to make things right, explicitly promising that he was already jumping into his car and would be at her front door in less than 30 minutes to beg for her forgiveness in person. Chloe looked down at the two beautiful girls smiling up at her with pure, unconditional love, tears streaming down her own face, and softly told the broken billionaire that they would be waiting for him. True to his frantic word, Edward Montgomery's sleek black luxury sedan screeched to a halt in front of the modest house exactly 28 minutes later, completely ignoring every single traffic law between Bel Air and East Los Angeles. He practically tore the car door off its hinges as he bolted up the short concrete walkway, looking entirely disheveled, completely terrified and utterly desperate to hold his precious children in his arms again. The bright green door opened before he could even knock, and Isabella and Sophia immediately launched themselves off the porch, crashing into their weeping father as he fell heavily to his knees on the hard sidewalk. He crushed them against his chest, burying his face in their hair, rocking back and forth, while repeatedly whispering breathless prayers of profound gratitude to the universe for keeping them completely safe during their incredibly dangerous journey. When Edward finally managed to look up through his heavy, blinding tears, he saw Chloe Harper standing quietly on the small porch, holding the screen door open, with a look of quiet, unshakable dignity. Edward slowly stood up, gently releasing his daughters, and walked toward the woman he had so viciously wronged, feeling smaller and more intensely ashamed than he ever had in his 45 years of life. He did not offer empty excuses or attempt to justify his terrible behavior. Instead, he bowed his head entirely and delivered the most sincere, agonizing apology, fully admitting that his massive pride had blinded him to her pure loyalty. He confessed that his daughters had taught him a brutal lesson in courage, proving that a completely innocent Nanny possessed vastly more integrity than the wealthy, powerful businessmen he surrounded himself with every single day. Evelyn slowly stepped out onto the porch behind her daughter, leaning heavily on her wooden cane, and fixed the powerful billionaire with a remarkably stern look that instantly reminded Edward of his own strict grandmother. Edward immediately addressed the elderly woman, his voice trembling with genuine remorse, explicitly promising that he would secure the absolute best medical specialists in the entire state of California to completely cure whatever ailments she was suffering from. He then turned back to a stunned Chloe, formally offering her not just her previous position back, but a massive raise, full benefits, and an explicit promise that she would be treated entirely as an equal member of their family. Sophia loudly cheered from the sidewalk, demanding that they all stop crying immediately and go back to their massive house so Chloe could finally finish building the giant sandcastle they had abandoned in the backyard. Exactly 1 week later, the sprawling Montgomery estate had undergone a massive, almost magical transformation that went far beyond mere physical renovations or expensive new decorations. Evelyn Harper was now comfortably residing in the incredibly luxurious first-floor guest suite, where a highly trained private nurse visited daily, and the elderly woman spent her afternoons happily knitting beautiful sweaters while sitting in the sunlit garden. Chloe had officially moved into the massive, beautifully remodeled suite on the second floor, a stunning space that Edward had explicitly redesigned to ensure she had absolute privacy while remaining intimately close to the young girls she adored. The entire house was constantly filled with the glorious ringing sounds of childish laughter, loud music playing from the kitchen, and the wonderful comforting smell of Mrs. Higgins's famous sweet bread, which Edward now ordered delivered every single morning. To celebrate the beginning of a new chapter, Edward hosted a grand dinner attended by Richard, who had apologized to Chloe, Dr. Thomas, who oversaw Evelyn's successful treatment, and Eleanor, whose joy brightened the room. Surrounded by flowers, candles, laughter, and meaningful conversation, Edward raised a toast thanking Isabella and Sophia for refusing to accept the broken future his pride had created, and expressing heartfelt gratitude to Chloe and Evelyn for offering him forgiveness and a second chance. Richard toasted Isabella's wisdom, Sophia eagerly called everyone to enjoy the chocolate cake, and Edward realized that his heart had finally found peace and completeness within their united family. Later that night, after the guests had left, Edward discovered a handwritten note from Isabella thanking him for finally showing the same courage that she and Sophia had shown, adding that their mother would be proud of the loving family they had built together. Holding the note close to his heart, Edward reflected on the lesson life had taught him. True fulfillment comes not from wealth or pride, but from humility. The willingness to admit mistakes, seek forgiveness, and embrace genuine human connection. He understood that real wisdom lies in allowing love, especially the honest and fearless love of children, to guide people back to compassion, healing, and their shared humanity.